Thank you for that.
You're very welcome.
Okay, again, I'm Derrick Willis, and I'll be talking about my paper today is Valid Cultural Understanding of Fatherhood, and it's locating race and personal development in these men's gender performances. This research was done in Metro Detroit, both Detroit, but the bulk of it had actually been conducted in Ypsilanti, Ann Arbor. And the people that were heading that project was Don Misra, Dr. Alfred Young Jr., and Patrick Caldwell, at those last two at U of M. And Don Misra is in the School of Public Health here at Wayne State. And so we were looking at birth outcomes with African Americans. We know that African Americans have a higher rate than the other group of having high rates of preterm births. And we're trying to find out what are things that are leading to these preterm births. We believe stress and things like structural racism to be in part implicated in that. Things that lend support to this belief is the fact that after 9/11, people of Middle Eastern descent, women in America who are Middle Eastern, experience higher rates of preterm births because of the stress that they encountered after 9/11, and the racism they experienced. So we see this as a mediating factor in the birth outcomes, the stress that women experience. When it comes to fatherhood, we think fathers play a role in the birth outcomes of the children. Fathers can help, in some ways, buffer, alleviate stress in the way they support their partners. But these same men can be a part of the stress too, and can be a part of that, preterm birth outcome. So we were trying to follow up and see what was going on with this experience, among African Americans in the Metro Detroit area. So talk a little bit about my methodology and theory. For this paper, we use focus groups. We use focus groups in Ypsilanti, some in Detroit, for men. We interviewed in focus groups maybe 10 to 12 men over three or four focus groups. And we use these life history narratives too from the focus groups, but also use life history narratives from my dissertation too. So I did my dissertation on coming of age among black men in Detroit, and I looked at what role alcohol played in the construction of manhood, but also looked at how they define manhood. And for some of these men, fatherhood was a key component to how they define what it meant to be a man. And so I used some of their narratives too, and I'll talk about that when I get to those parts. I also use these semi-structured and closed-ended questions. In anthropology, we do a lot of open-ended type questions. Public health people ask a lot of closed-ended questions, and they generate a lot of statistics. In anthropology, it's the stories that we tell from those open-ended questions. And that's what they brought me into the project, to help look at, encode, and analyze those open-ended questions. And I'll be talking today in this paper based on what those questions were and how they responded. And the theory that I use is life course theory, which is by one scholar named Ashley. He looks at the life course as something that helps people structure their lives, and they have things that help them, support them in reaching certain ideal goals. Like at a certain age, I'm expected to be a high school graduate, a college graduate. That's a trajectory that we expect ourselves to go on. So things that help us get to those things we see as giving us a sort of continuity. And then we have things that come along and promote what we call disruptions to this sort of gradual development progression that we think we might go on. So I look at this idea of continuity and disruption. It's experienced by, say, African American men in relationship to something like fatherhood. In their relationship to the economy too, part of it. In the era of both globalism and post-industrialism, black men have a very different relationship to the economy than, say, white men. And that definitely impacts on their lived experience, how they're experiencing fatherhood. I look at gender performance, and some of you have the book Fixing Men by Matthew Gutman, where he looks at the idea that masculinity is not a fixed category like we often try to see it as, but it's very malleable, very flexible. It's dependent upon a number of mediating factors like lived experience. Men have different aspirations, and there's no one cookie-cutter manner of how men can be men. There's a lot of fluidity to it. And I'm going to talk about that throughout this talk, how men at different points in time, they do different gender performances based on where they're at geographically, where they're at life stage-wise, and where they're at social class and things like that. It impacts whether they're in a public versus a private sphere. That impacts their gender performance. I'm going to go to the next page to make that point a little clearer. I start out with a quote from Mark Anthony Neal. He's a gender, and he also works in popular culture. He does gender studies. And he wrote this one excerpt in his book, The New Black Man, where he says, "I'm not the new black man, but rather the new black man is a metaphor for an imagined life, a way to be strong as a black man in new ways." And that's an apt way of framing what I'm talking about today. Strength is one of the biggest ways men define themselves, what it means to be a man. But strength in itself is something that, there's different types of strength, right? People can have physical strength. But I think what's even more significant is this sort of mental, emotional resolve strength, this type of resiliency that comes from being able to bounce back from adversity. That's the type of strength, I think, that has a much more enduring legacy. And it's this idea of being flexible to adjust to different circumstances. So that type of resilience that comes from it. This is what he's imagining for this new black man, this ability to sometimes be transformed and have, when life gives you lemons, you sort of make lemonades, or you have a turning point in life and you sort of move and you grow and you move on from that. But that bad experience or whatever experience doesn't just come to define you and you have this arrested development and you don't move further. So that's an important thing to just sort of think about. This idea of gender as a socio-cultural construct, back in 1935, Margaret Mead had a book called, it's like Temperament in Society or something like that. But it dealt with 3 different cultures in the Pacific Islands and how it showed how this idea of masculinity and even femininity, they're not fixed categories. In different societies, there are some societies where women were expected to be very assertive and aggressive, and that was seen as an attractive thing in a woman. In America, when we practice hegemonic masculinity, we think women should be more docile and this and that, but that universality of this idea of women being docile, at least in earlier times, they didn't subscribe to that in certain cultures. The same way we think men should be assertive and aggressive, some societies men were expected to be consensus builders and focus more on the relationship. So the things that have been seen as feminine in our Western way, some cultures saw that as a very attractive masculine trait. So there's these different ways of being both men and women. There's no one set way. And that's what Margaret Mead set out to prove, and she did a pretty good job of showing that. Another anthropologist, his name is David Gilmore. He had a book called Manhood in the Making. And in that, he talks about gender being something that is a fixed category. He sees all men having certain universal propensities. And that is propensity to honor what's called the 3 Ps in life. Men should be providers, men should be protectors, and men should be procreators. And he's saying cross-culturally, everywhere in the world, men are expected to perform these type of responsibilities. That actually looks a lot like hegemonic or traditional masculinity. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later. But you should know this when it comes to gender and these gender performances. Gender performances are very much, dictated by where you're at physically. What space you're in. Are you in the public sphere? You're on the streets. You're out in society. Or are you in a private sphere? Are you in a domestic arrangement in your home? And the type of performance you give is very different based on where you're at. I'm out on the streets, I'm out in the work, or I'm at home. We show very different performances. So I want you to think about how gender performances are very much mediated by, one's life stage development, also one's social class, and then physically where people are located at when they're doing the gender performances. Because their aspirations, men's aspirations are intimately tied to these mediating factors, where we're at geographically, where we're at socially and culturally. Very much, impacts our gender performances. And I use those 2 photos there because these 2 photos you see up there, the 2 young men, the teenagers, they're out on the street. That's the public performance. We call that mean mugging. They call it the cool pose by Billingsley and Majors with their book Cool Pose. And that's one way of framing what they're doing. But a lot of young folks take on the same persona. A lot of young men take on the persona as they try to cut their mother's apron strings to show themselves to be men. They often rely on the most stereotypical indexes of manhood because they haven't acquired the other trappings of manhood. Being able to be providers, they may not have been procreated